Hi there. My name is Ann Reynolds. I'm with American Clean Power, and we are about to get started with our webinar. Thanks so much for those of you that have joined us. I will say happy Capitol Hill Ocean Week, although I'm gathering probably the people participating in this webinar are remote from Washington, D.C. and not on the Hill this week. My name is Ann Reynolds. As I said, I work with American Clean Power. If you're not familiar with ACP, we are a national trade association that represents the whole range of clean energy technologies, of which offshore wind power is one, but it also includes solar, green hydrogen, land-based wind, and energy storage, as well as transmission. So I personally work on offshore wind energy. I am the vice president of offshore wind for ACP. I do that because it is a really exciting technology that can provide electricity for the United States, especially on the coasts where we have a lot of people that need it, and do so without creating air pollution that causes public health issues, as well as global warming emissions that cause climate change. So it's something that I feel really good about. But we do recognize that this industry will be sharing the ocean with lots of other stakeholders, with other industries, and with all of the species in the ocean. And so we want to do that responsibly. We want to develop this industry to make power without pollution and also with environmental protections of other types. And we want to pay attention to all of the facets and components of that responsibility. I know that you are all attending or listening in on a lot of events this week for Capitol Hill Ocean Week, and there is another offshore wind panel that's in person tomorrow at 1:15, entitled The Path Forward for Responsible Offshore Wind Energy. And there's some great speakers for that, and they're going to tackle conservation issues and stakeholder engagement and community support for offshore wind, all of those very important topics. And in order to prepare people for that, we just wanted to give a very basic check-in on the status of the offshore wind industry and address any questions that you might have, and then take a deeper dive into one of the many issues facing the industry, which is fisheries impacts and fisheries mitigation. So to help me out with the first part is two of my colleagues from American Clean Power. Moira, who you see on screen, is our director of Eastern States at ACP. And because those Eastern states are spending a lot of time and attention on offshore wind, she has a lot of expertise on offshore wind issues for the East Coast. And Molly Croll, who you also see on screen, is our Pacific offshore wind director for American Clean Power, and also manages the Coastal California Leaseholders Group that we run. So we'll run through some information on the industry as it stands today, and then we'll turn it over to Kris, who you also see on screen. She's the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, and they do a variety of projects to support responsible development of the offshore wind industry. But prior to that, Kris has 20 years of experience in the offshore wind and ocean conservancy space, working for 3 different offshore wind developers, I think, Kris, as well as Ocean Conservancy and Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, Ecology and Environment, et cetera. So she's actually the most perfect person to talk about fisheries mitigation and what the industry is trying to do to streamline a process to address that. So without further, I will say, as I am attempting to share my screen, and you all can tell me if I'm doing this correctly and it looks okay. Does it look okay? Good, thank you so much. That if you'd like to ask a question, I think you can type that into the Q&A function of Zoom, and we're going to try to reserve half the time for questions, or at least maybe a quarter of the time, depending on how long we go. So just very basic information to set the stage here. As shown on this slide, offshore wind is super active all around the globe. The United States is, frankly, a bit behind. For 20 years, there's been turbines being installed in Europe. In much more recent years, China has pulled ahead in terms of megawatts of capacity installed. And this illustrates that fact that there's a lot of European countries that are pursuing offshore wind for their renewable energy goals, and also, of course, to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels from Russia or other countries. We have a number of leases active on these show in the sort of northeastern states. Show you where they are. There are 3 U.S. operating projects. One is the Block Island Wind Farm. One is a pilot project in Virginia. And the third is the South Fork Wind Farm, which is feeding into my home state of New York on the eastern end of Long Island. So, you know, you can see here that the ones that are operating are getting bigger. And it's exciting news, especially that South Fork is already bringing electricity to shore. There's 3 U.S. projects that are currently under construction. Vineyard Wind 1 is going to feed power into Massachusetts. It already is doing so, even though not all of the turbines are installed and it's still under construction. The Coastal Virginia project will be feeding into Virginia and is large, the largest under development now. So that's very exciting. And then Revolution Wind is going to be a 704 megawatt project already under construction, and is going to be selling that electricity to both Connecticut and Rhode Island. So you can see the trend here that the projects have gotten bigger. The ones under construction now are no longer pilot projects or smaller projects. And then you can see here that there's 28 leases in active development on the East Coast. So number of projects behind these 6 to reach construction in the coming years. In addition to the East Coast leases, there's one lease area on the Gulf of Mexico. You can see that lease is held now by RWE. It's from an auction, a lease sale that the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management had in this past August. So 10 months or so ago. There's also a number of leases on the California coast, but I'm going to let Molly talk about those. She has a good map of those. And more leasing on the way. So just this past April, so a few weeks back, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management announced a 5-year schedule for leasing additional federal lands offshore for offshore wind power development. You can see here that they're planning 4 leases this year in 2024. So BOEM's going to be extremely busy this year. And I believe they also have the goal of executing those leases, so getting them signed before the end of the calendar year. And then lease 1 each of the next 2 years, 2 in 2027, and 4 in 2028. So that's the plan as it stands today for increasing the amount of land that's leased for offshore wind development. The other thing I wanted to mention before I turn it over to Moira to talk more about the East Coast is that there is a good number of vessels that are being constructed in the United States to serve this new industry, at least 43 that we know of. Many of them are crude transport vessels. A few are service vessels where they might even serve as like a hotel at sea for the folks working to service these facilities. There is a couple barges, a couple tugs, and 1 turbine installation vessel. That's the Charybdis, which is under construction now in Texas. It was recently moved to the water, but it's still under construction. So, you know, folks might have come to this industry from a variety of directions. Either it's support for clean power, desire to develop a new industry in the United States, or a desire to have a new energy in U.S. vessel manufacturing. And that's another benefit that we see from this industry. So Moira, I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk through a few slides. And again, a reminder to people, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A function in Zoom.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Anne. Good afternoon to everyone joining us today. I'm here to talk a little bit about where things stand on offshore wind development along the east coast of the United States. And if you were a couple minutes late in joining us, I'm Moira Cyphers. I'm with the American Clean Power Association. I run state legislative and regulatory affairs on the East Coast. And as Anne mentioned at the top of her remarks, offshore wind is a clean source of generation, and it's really critically important. It's the key to states meeting their climate goals. About half the projects you see on the map here are fairly far along in their permitting process. I think states are really focused on state by state efforts and also meeting national greenhouse gas reduction goals. And without offshore wind, those targets get a lot more difficult to meet. So right now, East Coast states are working hard to adopt the right policies to help this growing industry attain scale. So in addition to being clean and reliable, offshore wind is a massive economic development opportunity for driving job creation in coastal communities, fueling a domestic supply chain, like Ian mentioned, including shipbuilding and investment across the US, not just on the East Coast, really represents that. And Anne, if you could hit to the next slide, that would be great. So while the federal government is largely responsible for leasing and much of the environmental siting and permitting work, states across the Eastern Seaboard are helping to really establish the market for offshore wind energy. And as part of that, are working to secure the domestic supply chain investments and the jobs that come along with manufacturing and construction. East Coast states all in have some pretty ambitious targets, about 60 gigawatts. Those targets goals are very important. They signal to developers that there's a market for the offshore wind energy they're producing, and for supply chain companies, manufacturers, that it's time to invest because these projects are getting built. To meet these targets, how do states get to their goals? They procure offshore wind energy. Each state approaches procurement differently, and we've seen a lot of changes in the markets and how states are procuring over the last few years, and in particular the last 2 or so. Like many sectors of the US economy, inflation has upended costs for every component of offshore wind, from the raw materials that go into building turbines to the costs of financing a project. And then at the same time, the US supply chain for offshore wind has still been in development. And so needing to rely on Europe while we get our supply chain up off the ground here domestically has also led to some delays in getting projects built. So over the past year-ish, states have really been recalibrating their plans and approaches to bringing more offshore wind online and keeping their climate and clean energy goals on track. This flexibility really, I think, reflects the state's commitment to building this market. We've seen in the Northeast, 3 states agreed to jointly procure offshore wind energy together. That's Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, potentially procuring enough power to power about 2 million homes from offshore wind. Those announcements, project selections, and awards are expected to be made in August of this year. And the benefits of a multi-state procurement include the potential for huge economies of scale, bringing costs down for ratepayers and developers alike. And this multi-state procurement is the first of its kind and a pretty groundbreaking approach. Farther south, there's a lot going on in the Mid-Atlantic. But Delaware released a report suggesting multi-state procurements were a good path for them to explore, and that state is poised to not only pass their first offshore wind goal later this month, but also with the encouragement of the state legislature to look to Maryland and New Jersey for some potential joint procurement and work on transmission. Maryland has passed 2 bills in recent years to increase their goal from about 1,200 gigawatts to 8.5 gigawatts, and also pass legislation to ensure that there's more flexibility in the way the state can procure offshore wind and react to some of the recent market changes. Massachusetts, similarly, reevaluating their clean energy procurement program. And I think, New York, like many things, is the model. They've really had a deft hand in dealing with changes to the offshore wind market and supply chain announcements. And so the speed at which they're trying to streamline their process and really get to those carbon reduction goals is pretty inspiring. And finally, the other thing that we've seen the states do and that we're working to partner with them on is ventured into a transmission consortium. So largely across the Northeast, states are working together to figure out the complex issues of transmission, interconnection, distribution, to ensure that we have what we need to get all of those green electrons on the grid, and do it as affordably as we possibly can. So you may have seen some negative headlines about offshore wind in the news, but like Anne mentioned, 2024 has been a pretty incredible year for offshore wind. We do have 2 projects selling into the grid. So South Fork in New York, Vineyard 1, which is a project off the coast of Massachusetts. Construction is beginning in Virginia on the US's largest offshore wind project, and there's a project underway in Rhode Island too. We think it's reasonable to expect close to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to be built over the course of the next decade. That is huge. That's an enormous jump from where we are today. And as states want to go bigger through 2050, we recognize the scale of the opportunity here and also the scale of the challenges. So the good news is that we're not alone in the work we're doing. And if you would just hit the next slide, please. We've got partners in labor, we've got partners in industry, and then on the next slide, some of our most important partners, which are environmental and climate groups. So we work at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, trying to push for policy and advocacy changes that'll really ensure that we can do offshore wind right and give the states the support and the resources they need to establish what is essentially a new energy market in a new industry that will have generational impacts. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Molly.
Yeah, sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Molly Croll. I'm the Pacific Director of Offshore Wind at ACP. I work primarily in California on policy, regulatory, permitting, and other issues. Next slide. So for those of you who don't know, on the Pacific coast, we're going to be doing all floating offshore wind. The shape of the outer continental shelf is such that the water gets really deep really fast. So we can't feasibly be installing foundations into the seafloor. We have to float them. So this is a basic schematic of what that looks like. You see the floating foundation, concrete steel structure secured to its spot in a wind farm through several mooring lines and then anchors. Each then has electrical cable that feeds into a collector station or converter station, which then transmits power to shore via an undersea cable and then connects into the grid. This schematic is a little weird. It makes it look like these are really close to shore, but they're actually 20 miles from shore or more. So often very deep waters. Next slide. So in California, we had the first offshore wind auction in December 2022. There were 5 leases awarded. The leases got executed in June 2023. And where they are, there's 2 off of Humboldt County. So that's the very north part of California. You can see the red area up here. And then 3 off the San Luis Obispo County in the central coast of California. So in total, these projects could house about 10,000 megawatts of offshore wind. And again, you can see quite far from the shore. Next slide. So some of the things we're working on in California, we're at this sort of very beginning of what is going to be a 10-year development cycle. And a lot of that timing is driven by the associated infrastructure. So we like to talk about offshore wind as not just energy policy, but like industrial policy and infrastructure policy, because of all the things that need to come together to make it happen. For floating, one of the very interesting and also challenging parts of the proposition is that floating turbines need to be assembled port side. So fixed bottom offshore wind, usually you take a really, really big ship and do the final assembly out in the ocean. For floating, it's all going to happen right at port side, which requires a very specialized port with enough area to store some of the major components, probably do your foundation manufacturing, have enough weight support, wharf strength to be able to put these gigantic platforms on them, then get them into the ocean and do your final assembly before tugging them out to an installation site. In California, the best places this will happen are likely to be at the port of Humboldt, which right now is a pretty small harbor style port, but received a $426 million grant from the federal government to begin its conversion into an offshore wind terminal. And then the other location is the Port of Long Beach, which is a very active port, does primarily intermodal container port that has proposed to build a few offshore wind terminals, each terminal being able to do assembly for one turbine at a time. Next slide. Permitting is another area that's going to be very interesting and a little bit different in California. This is like a very, you're not supposed to be able to read it, but just see there's a lot going on for California permitting, in addition to the BOEM process, whereby the leaseholders are, at this stage, having just been awarded their leases last year, have prepared survey plans, submitted to the BOEM. One company is beginning their surveys really to just see, what does the seafloor look like? What does the ocean look like in my development area? And be able to build their plans upon that. Next, they'll develop a full construction and operation plan, which will go through the NEPA process at BOEM. But California will also do California Environmental Quality Act review on the whole of the project. So sort of a second layer on top of NEPA. There's, in addition to that, a number of state and federal agencies that will have some sort of permitting or review. So one of the things we're working on is, okay, this is very comprehensive, but how do we sequence or rather do a lot of this work at the same time in a way that's not overly duplicative or slows things down. Next slide. Transmission is the other big piece of infrastructure. Somewhat differently from the East Coast as well, the transmission system near the landfall sites for offshore wind in California is not very well developed, especially in Humboldt. It's a super remote area, a lot of trees, not much else going on, not a major load center by any means. So the grid needs to be upgraded on land first, and then potentially through major subsea options to deliver the capacity of energy developed there to load centers. On the Central Coast, it's a little bit easier. There's a nuclear plant that should retire in the relatively near future, freeing up some transmission capacity. This year, we had a big success in that California has approved the first start of transmission upgrade to facilitate about 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind from the Humboldt area. Next slide. Moira talked a lot about state market development, super important in California. And I think you may have focused on like the big blue square that's 25 gigawatts for California. That is the state's adopted planning goal for offshore wind, which is great. It's really awesome to have that goal, but we need to translate that sort of loose goal into actual procurement action, which means finding a way for the load serving entities collectively to plan to buy the power from offshore wind once it comes online. So worked hard last year on a piece of legislation for central procurement, meaning the state can buy offshore wind on behalf of all of the customers of the state, and then apportion out the values or the attributes as well as the costs of that resource evenly. And now we're at the stage of trying to implement that legislative policy on the regulatory side. Next slide. And then people. So, of course, very important in all things offshore wind. Kris is going to be talking about engagement with the fishing industry on the East Coast. We're working on that on the West Coast as well. Engagement with tribes, thinking about how the onshore infrastructure affects people. Moira talked about the importance of job creation. A huge selling point for offshore wind is the opportunity to create a new, really thriving industry within the state of California that's connected to its clean energy ambitions. Environmental justice considerations, like how can this help shut down a nuclear plant, shut down a natural gas plant along the coast. And then, you know, also in California, we think about things like we're a big state. Where does the infrastructure lie that is serving the coast versus the Central Valley, and who gets the benefits of what? So I will transition now to Kris to talk about offshore wind and fishing interactions.
Thanks so much, Molly.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having us and talking about offshore wind as part of Capitol Hill Oceans Week. Such an important emerging use of the oceans, and just all figuring out how we can do this new and exciting new sector in a way that really supports existing ocean users, and to the greatest extent we can, the coexistence among those users. And certainly the fishing community is one of the longest standing users of the ocean space, and working alongside with the fishing community, one question that has been raised in my 20 plus years now in offshore wind is how will we be compensated? How will we be compensated for the lack of access to our space, to the potential changes in the fisheries ecosystems and composition, and to our ability to essentially pursue our livelihoods? How will those impacts first be avoided, secondly minimized, and then to the extent that they cannot be avoided or minimized, how will they be mitigated? And fisheries compensation, financial compensation, is certainly one of those tools that is in the toolkit. And Anna, if you'll just move to the first slide, I'll talk a little bit about the special initiative on offshore wind and the project that we've been working on now for well over 2 years. We are a third-party independent nonprofit, and we have been supporting the convening and facilitation of 11 states on the East Coast. The service we're providing is essentially enabling them to meet as a peer group among the 11 states, and really considering each of their approaches to fisheries compensation and how they can kind of work together to create a regional system. As we all know, both wind and the oceans are regional. They don't really adhere to state boundaries. And so having a regional approach to fisheries compensation and offshore wind, which we see, I think, kind of happening more and more all the time, I think is super relevant. SIOW in general, we are a foundation-funded organization. We are not a trade group like ACP. We are typically working at the behest of federal and state policymakers to advance the responsible development of U.S. offshore wind. In this case, we're working with the Consensus Building Institute, or CBI, on the facilitation of this group. So it was, really the states who reached out, and we're looking for support on this initiative. And if you could please move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about who those states are and how they're moving this forward. The 11 Atlantic coast states you see listed on this slide are essentially from Maine to North Carolina. In addition to the working with the 11 states, they have also sought advice from the fishing industry, from federal agencies, and the developers through the American for Clean Power Association. And really with the intent is to establish a fund that is accessible to fisheries porting from or landing in each of the East Coast states, not only the 11 states listed here. So even though there are only 11 of the states, certainly if South Carolina, Georgia, or Florida had fishermen who were being impacted by offshore wind development, they could, in theory, apply for compensation through this regional fund that is currently being established. The origin of this fund and this working group was essentially back in June of 2021. So, boy, that's 3 years ago now, when the 9 states, all the states that are listed here except for North Carolina and Delaware, sent a letter to the Biden administration urging regional methods to be deployed when looking at fishing impacts or just general impacts from offshore wind, and really asking BOEM what their role might be in terms of being able to administer a regional fisheries compensation fund. Through working with BOEM, we learned that they do not, in fact, have the authority to administer a fund such as this. And so, kind of being the next best alternative, the states have taken up the mantle and are bringing forward this program. Next slide, please. The state's objective, as stated, is to establish a credible regional administrator for managing and distributing fisheries compensatory mitigation funds for offshore wind for the US Eastern Seaboard. And one of the most important things we can always stress when in this program is that mitigation is only to be used when first avoiding and minimizing options have been completely exhausted. So, as I'm sure folks on the line are familiar, really leaning into that NEPA hierarchy and making sure that avoiding and minimizing have all been done first. A lot of the avoiding really happens at the siting and leasing phase with the federal regulators, and that process of just avoiding, to the extent possible, the most sensitive or lucrative fishing grounds. Then the minimizing happens where developers are able to maybe microsite or change the layout or adapt their wind farm to help support continued fishing. And then from there, really moving on to the mitigation where those two options cannot be used any further. Next slide, please. The state's objectives in developing this program is to create consistency across projects and developers for compensation. Essentially, one of the biggest challenges is that we have clusters of offshore wind projects, and it's very hard to tease out which projects are causing which impacts to the fishermen in terms of the financial aspects. And so to be able to create a consistent program, a one-stop shop where fishermen could come one time and say, in theory, we had a certain level of revenue, or collection of years from years, 2020 to 2024. And now once this wind farm has been built, we're having a reduced amount of revenue. Being able to take that, look at it like a direct payment claim through a typical like insurance provider or other, is really, the goal. Part of this is to create fairness for fisheries across port of origin and port of landing, to create the one-stop shop, and also to scale a program that's large enough to create expertise and efficiencies. Right now, there are two established compensation programs that are out there. One is for Vineyard Wind 1, and one is for South Fork Wind, the two operating or partially operating wind farms that are on the eastern seaboard. And each one of those times, we saw a recreation of the proverbial wheel. And so being able to do these, to kind of create one program with the working across the fishing and the offshore wind and state sectors all together, will really build efficiencies and expertise that will also help avoid and reduce costs. Next slide, please. In terms of scoping for the regional fund administrator, and if you move to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about really the compensatory mitigation and the role of the fund administration. Now, to be clear, these funds will all be paid from offshore wind developers. So developers are going to be paying into a regional fund is the concept. And then within the blue dotted box, you'll see two main functions: managing the money and then distributing the money. So money managed and money out. We do like to often reference, though, money in, because that is certainly an important part of it, though the regional fund administrator will have little to no influence on how money actually gets into the fund. Really, that comes from developers, and really the lion's share of that will be through determining what potential impacts there are from the wind farm, which happens through the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, process. once the final environmental impact statement is completed and there's a record of decision issued, there is, a determination by BOEM on the potential levels of impact of that wind farm. Now, fortunately, NIMS has created a wonderful data set, and I could put a link in the chat later, where you can actually look by lease area to see what the potential impacts to commercial and recreational for hire fishing communities will be in that specific lease area. So BOEM has a really good starting place to work on what the potential impacts will be. And certainly working with NIMS as a cooperating agency is key in helping BOEM to understand that kind of money in and how that happens. Other sources of money in would include, things that you may have seen in sale notices from BOEM that say a certain percentage of the cash award or the cash amount for the lease area would be then dedicated to a community benefit agreement or fisheries compensation or workforce. So in this case, we're talking about fishing compensation and how, those funds could be directed to a regional program. For the case of the regional fund administrator, we're really focusing on their scope of the money managed and then how the money is paid out based on those individual claims. Next slide, please. The potential fund administrator has a variety of different tasks. And really the ones highlighted in the center of the slide are to design the regional fund program, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, to share and communicate that out directly with the stakeholders, to review claims that come in, to verify those claims, and then to pay those out. You can move to the next slide. And I see we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll accelerate my pace. I'll turn to my New Jersey pace of speech that I've been slowing down for the webinar. But to catch folks up on the current status of this program, NYSERDA at the state of New York has been serving as the procurement agent for the 11 states and released an RFP that was really designed around a request for information that was released the year prior in the key elements on, what would be the role of this regional fund administrator. Based on background research and work we did, we estimated that it would cost $2.5 or so million to design and develop and launch this regional fund. So we were able to secure funding from offshore wind developers, states, and foundations in order to work on this broader fundraising initiative. And that is kind of exactly where we are now. So Anne, if you would move to the next slide. We are in the design and development phase. The regional fund administrator is in the process of being selected. By the end of the summer, they should be selected, announced publicly, and then fully onboarded. And Anne, if you'll move to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what their essential role is. So going through where we've been, the RFI was released where we collected information to feed into the RFP. Sorry for so many acronyms. The procurement phase was really, this, phase where we're in now and transitioning from, which is where, the RFA is onboarded and contracted with NYSERDA. And then the claims design and development process is the kind of really juicy part that we're about to enter. And on the next slide, we'll take a look at how stakeholders are influencing this process, because, we really did need to be able to give the regional fund administrator the overarching ability to make and design this program without question and with impunity. However, there really needed to be strong input. And what we're doing is really a bottom-up design and development approach that starts with a broad engagement of the fisheries by species, by gear type, similar to the bottom-up fisheries management council process. Ad hoc workshops, interviews, meetings, et cetera, then have funneled into what we're calling the Design Oversight Committee, or the DOC, which are a subset of the fishing community who are working together with the developers and the states in order to, really inform the regional fund administrator on the nuances and priorities of the fishing community, the offshore wind developers, and the states, right? These all need to work together in order for the regional fund to really click and work. So we can just move to the next slide and we'll just buzz through these, Anne, but the Design Oversight Committee will be comprised of the states, the developers, the fishermen who have kind of double the seats for, a little more weight on part of that committee, with including ex officio members from the agencies and then other liaisons to support other specific topic areas. Next slide, please. The key elements for the DOC or Design Oversight Committee to advise on, and there's always many questions about this, but who is eligible to receive funds? What is the evidence needed to prove, the impacts? What are compensable costs and losses? What are the multipliers related to compensation? What are the data sources? What are the process? What should that look like? So all of that is being really determined now. And next slide, please. I think just go on to the next slide, and this will be our timeline, but essentially we'll be contracting with the regional fund administrator this summer. One thing I just want to say as a little public service announcement is next week we'll be hosting webinars for the fishing community to bring together and have the caucus select the members of the Design Oversight Committee. And so folks should feel free to reach out to me. I may have my contact information on the last slide. If not, I'll put it in the chat. I do not, I apologize. I'll put it in the chat. Absolutely looking for nominations for the Design Oversight Committee from the fishing community. And so we're really looking forward to operationalizing this program. And thank you all for your attention, and looking forward to any questions, and turn it back to you, Anne.
Looks like Anne is still
I
on
got
mute. There you
stuck
go.
on, I got stuck on. So we do have a few questions, and I'm gonna hustle here to see if we can answer them. One is, are environmental impact assessments done prior to the building of offshore wind farms? And the answer to that is an absolute yes. It's a very lengthy environmental assessment process. It's done before the lease, before the wind energy area is established and the leased by BOEM, and then again for the project as the project is proposed. Another question, how is the protection of wildlife in those areas being ensured? So I don't know, Kris, do you want to take a shot at that, or anyone?
Say that again, Anne. If someone wants us to take it, I was distracted. I didn't hear you.
So how is the protection of wildlife in those areas being ensured?
Yeah, well, I think, and I appreciate the folks from ACP kind of highlighting the very multi-level permitting process that's required. That's really not only at the federal, but then the state and local levels, really guided by those NEPA principles and the NEPA process. But then, with some dozen other agencies, related and really looking at those potential impacts. In addition, a variety of baseline studies are required. So we're looking at avian species, whales, birds, and bats, making sure that there's an understanding sufficient for baseline information so that that can be measured against, and then understood if there are potential impacts from wind farms, and particularly how those cumulative impacts start to work and how we can use adaptive management to ensure that we're doing right by the environment, doing this thing that we know does right by the environment. So
thanks, Kris. We have another question. Should offshore wind be allowed in national marine sanctuaries? And if so, what is the best way to implement offshore wind in these sanctuaries in a way that does not harm the local environment and wildlife? I'm wondering, Molly, if you want to take a shot at that, given some real world experience on the West Coast.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think first it's important to talk about, well, what do we mean by offshore wind in the sanctuaries? Are we talking about having turbines constructed within a sanctuary? You're talking about having a substation in the floating substation in the sanctuary? You're talking about having transmission lines go through it? Because obviously those things have different types of impacts or implications for a sanctuary. In California, we've sort of come right up against this question recently. I think many of you have heard of the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary, which is the first ever sanctuary nominated by a Native American tribe, the Northern Chumash Tribal Council. That is a huge sanctuary. It would go basically from the south end of the Monterey Bay Sanctuary to all the way to where the Channel Island Sanctuary begins, around Santa Barbara. And as originally envisioned, I mean, the main idea was continue to protect the Pacific Ocean around California, you know, prevent any further oil and gas exploration. But it did end up having implications for the San Luis Obispo lease areas, which are outside of the designated sanctuary boundaries, so would be built to the west of where the sanctuary is proposed, but would need to be able to connect to shore through the sanctuary. So there was a lot of conversations with NOAA and stakeholders and developers and the nominating tribe, which ultimately resulted in an agreement between the nominating tribe and the leaseholders, the offshore wind leaseholders, that has now been endorsed by some like 60 environmental groups as well, to pursue an approach for that sanctuary where the first phase of the sanctuary is south of where the transmission lines would need to come, or the offshore cables would need to come through. And then a second phase would sort of be set up with the designation of this sanctuary to close up the gap between that, you know, farther south initial boundary and the northern connection to the Monterey Sanctuary envisioned. So it's an interesting question about what kind of infrastructure should be allowed within sanctuaries. That's sort of going to depend on what the sanctuary's purposes are, how the management of that and the regulations are set up. But I think this is a really good example of where there can appear to be some conflicts at first, but with thoughtful engagement and everybody coming to the table, there can be also really productive solutions.
Thank you so much, Molly. I'm about to give you an impossible task because we have another interesting question, but we have 1 minute in which to have it be answered. And the question, and maybe the answer is pointing the person to an information resource. But the question is, I'm curious to learn more about how floating turbines work. Specifically, how is the power line connected to shore without animals like whales running into them and getting entangled?
Yeah, interesting. So you would need it would actually be a number of cables from each offshore wind farm that go, you know, down from the collector station that's either floating or semi-submersible to the seafloor, and then would run along the seafloor, be probably partially buried when closer to coming onto land to connect to an onshore substation. So yes, you would need that cable. They are large, relatively large. They're not likely to be something that a whale and also taut. So it's not something that would be likely to cause entanglement. Similarly, the mooring cables, so the cables that connect the floating platform down to the sea floor that are anchored, those are really big. Cables are smaller, but in any case, the electric cables, I don't think anyone believes that they would cause any kind of a direct entanglement risk. You know, I think there could be a chance that fishing gear would get collected on them and then cause a secondary risk. But that can absolutely be mitigated through close monitoring. And similarly on the mooring cables, the most studies and analysis shown they're big enough. Marine mammals are absolutely going to avoid them. They're not going to get tangled up in them. It's more of the question of what about secondary entanglement from interactions with fishing gear. I probably took more than a minute answering that, but
that's okay. There's some more questions that we don't have time for. One of them is about how local communities get engaged. And I will say there's an extensive community engagement process in the federal permitting. And then usually there's a state permitting component on the East Coast. It's different in California and more extensive in California, but on the East Coast for the cable coming ashore, and the community where it lands usually negotiates a tax agreement or a community benefits agreement. So there's a lot of opportunities for that engagement, and a good responsible developer will provide even more opportunities above and beyond what the permitting process requires. There's one last question. This is for you, Kris, because the person asked, can you repeat the purpose of the meetings going on next week?
Yes, next week we have a series of webinars in order to share information about the selection process for the fishing community members of the Design Oversight Committee. Again, that committee that will be feeding up and information into the regional fund administrator. And I did put my my email address in the chat, which is very easy, Kris@offshorewindpower.org, Kris with a K. So do feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to learn more about the self-nomination process for potential Design Oversight Committee membership for the Regional Fund Administrator. We'd love to have you join the webinar and learn more about the nomination process.
And you also, Kris, have a great website called offshorewindfacts.org or .com.
Correct. I'll drop that in the chat as well.
If folks want to learn more. We really appreciate all of your participation, and thank you so much to the entire Capitol Hill Ocean Week organization for giving us the opportunity to do this. And a reminder that if you are in DC in person, there's an offshore wind panel tomorrow at 1:15. So thanks to Moira, Molly, and Kris for all of the information you shared, and happy Capitol Hill Ocean Week. Take care, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.